background of my research is really in British institutional histories and not South Asian studies, so I'm really sort of privileged to listen to all of your expertise. So I'm speaking today about the 1982 exhibition that David already described, and although the beginning of the global turn in curatorial practice has often been placed in 1989, many aspects of it were addressed by the Oxford Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, in its pioneering international exhibitions of the early 1980s. This paper will focus on how the 5-month suite of exhibitions devoted to contemporary India in 1982 represented an effort to intervene in Eurocentric discourses on art and culture of the early 1980s. I'm going to concentrate particularly on one exhibition, Aspects of Modern Indian Art. So Oxford's project, collectively titled India, Myth and Reality, had its roots in the Festival of India that took place in London in 1982, an event designed to allow Britain to, quote, display not only India's glorious past, but also its dynamic present and its hopeful future, in a manner determined in close collaboration with Indian historians and diplomats. Despite India's insistence on its own modernity, however, the planned coverage of contemporary art remained rather thin in the eyes of organising committee member Ibrahim Al-Qazi. In May 1981, Al-Qazi wrote to London dealer Victor Musgrave to express his dissatisfaction with the festival's proposed contemporary representation and to suggest working together on a proposed 6 or 7 supplementary exhibitions. Musgrave, who had supported Indian art since the 1950s and had been among those complaining to the Arts Council and press about the lack of contemporary art in the festival schedule, contacted Eliot with Al-Qazi's idea. He promised that should MoMA agree to serve as host organisation, he would provide, quote, the most comprehensive exhibition of modern Indian art ever held in the West, with the very best artists, a large public, and a short trip to India, not strictly essential, as I know all the artists, at Air India's expense. MoMA assented. By July 1981, Al-Qazi sent him and Musgrave a meticulously detailed 8-page outline for 4 Oxford exhibitions and a comprehensive catalogue. By October, he was running what he called 4 cells in Delhi and Bombay, each dedicated to researching and organising different aspects of the project. Although approved by Eliot, the programme was devised and arranged primarily by Al-Qazi and his India-based team of friends and relatives. In addition to local knowledge and connections with artists and politicians, he and his brother provided extremely generous financial support for the exhibitions. In May 1982, the first segment of the tripartite Indian season opened at MoMA. Gods of the byways, wayside shrines of Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat dominated the galleries of the ground floor and was supported by screen idols, Indian film posters from the 1950s to the present. From June through August, the headline painting and sculpture exhibition Aspects of Modern Indian Art took over the upper and middle galleries, paired with a display of popular religious prints, the Indian calendar. The other India, 7 contemporary photographers, formed the final instalment. Throughout, a series of screenings presented Oxford audiences with relevant cinema and documentaries. Still more striking than the scope of the Oxford project is the sheer heterogeneity of its picture of contemporary India. Rather than attempting to encapsulate the spirit of the nation in a single exhibition, Eliot and Al-Qazi took a multifaceted approach. Modernist painting and sculpture were juxtaposed with traditional rural sacred objects, mass-produced prints, both religious and secular, documentary photography, and various kinds of film, in ways that resisted reductive cultural simplifications. It also called into question traditional Western art historical hierarchies of genre and medium, inviting visitors to reconsider conventional distinctions between art and artifact, high and low, new and old, avant-garde and kitsch. The title of perhaps the most art historically orthodox exhibition, Aspects of Modern Indian Art, was phrased to avoid any totalizing claims about the foreign culture under consideration, the kinds of claims that have been rightly the object of critique. MoMA's kaleidoscopic treatment of India's identity was strikingly sophisticated compared with the standard format of the National Survey show, but the concept of a cluster of exhibitions and events was also adopted by the Festival of India. Compared with its dizzying array, the diversity at MoMA seems more limited, but while London aimed to canvass all of India's history and achievements through manifestations across every significant public museum in the city, Elliott and Al-Kazi brought different views of contemporary India together within a single regional modern art gallery. MoMA made a more concerted statement than any single London organisation, and more of it did so about modern India exclusively. Myth and reality was conceptualised as representing culture produced since independence in 1947. While the exhibition's consciously post-colonial identity was not emphasised in the museum's publicity and publications, it nonetheless supported a politicised analysis of India's culture in the position of the British spectator. For Elliott, the loaded context of colonialism and its aftermath was precisely what made it so relevant to MoMA's audiences. More specifically, he wanted to correct the absence of a contemporary India in the British public imagination. Quote, "All people thought about India was old art, the Raj, and this kind of thing. Why is the folk art so easy to like? The modern art, why was it much more difficult, much more painful?" End quote. The orientalizing tendency to see India as timeless and mystical rather than modern and politicized was the main driver behind the critique of the festival's organization led by Rashid Areen in the pages of Art Monthly. For him and his co-signatories, including Victor Musgrave, the erasure of contemporary culture in the official festival was a form of colonialism, quote, "a way of keeping people in their place and preserving the status quo," end quote. It's clear that these critiques played a part in the final form of India, Myth and Reality. Art historian Rebecca M. Brown has recently praised aspects of modern Indian art for its diversity and its thematic organization, suggesting that it makes the American Festival of India exhibitions of 1985 look unidimensional, male artist-driven, formally focused, and painting-centered. In fact, of Oxford's 20 artists, only 2 were female, Nalini Milani and Mrinalini Mukherjee, while a mere 3 showed sculpture instead of painting, Mukherjee, K.G. Subramanian, and Anish Kapoor. Ratios which are impressive by comparison with their US counterparts alone. The Oxford show was thematically organised under headings such as Nature as Pictorial Metaphor, Forest, Mountain, River, and The Urban Scene, Strangers in the City. For Brown, these arrangements supported social and political readings, appropriately situating these artists within a framework of emergent Indian modernity, rather than formalist interpretations that would position the artists as stylistically indebted to the West. On the other hand, Oxford's groupings were loose, and each artist was represented by a number of works within a single category, allowing the exhibition and catalogue to be experienced as a series of monographic clusters. The catalogue especially celebrates the individuality of these artists through prose biographies, photographic portraits, and quotations. This form of presentation may be understood in light of Al-Kazi's stated ambition to insert Indian artists into the Western canon. Writing to Elliott Musgrave in 1981, he framed the Oxford project within a wider polemical enterprise. Quote, "What I am concerned with is the art of the Third World, its neglect, its misinterpretation and misevaluation, its innate significance, and its relevance not only to its own societies, but to the world as a whole." To accomplish this goal, Al-Kazi and his collaborators appropriated the trappings of the great Western artist. This tendency continues in the catalogue's introductory essay, which adopts the language of post-romantic Western art history to carve out a role for the Indian artist as heroic, tormented, and self-expressive. These are works of art, it claims, which, quote, "writhe with a sense of humiliation, despair, and anger," end quote. They have, quote, "a searing sense of honesty." They, quote, reflect the anguish and the doubts of the dislocated Indian persona and seek to tear off its illusions," end quote. Admittedly, such heady emotion is identified with, quote, the rawness of the times, rather than a timeless existential struggle. Nonetheless, the aggression repeatedly ascribed to these artists, who tear, sear, hammer, and expose, recalls the comfortably masculinist, individualist tropes of the Western modernist, recently revived by 1981's A New Spirit of Painting, as much as it raises the threatening spectre of collective colonial insurrection. Similar contradictions and ambivalences mark the exhibition's relationship to questions of national identity. Visitors to Aspects were confronted by the words of Rabindranath Tagore emblazoned on the walls of the entrance. In lines taken from his 1926 lecture, The Meaning of Art, it read, quote, "I strongly urge our artists vehemently to deny their obligation to produce something that can be labelled as Indian art." End quote. Instead of being preoccupied by India's past, artists should be, I quote, "exploring unknown shrines of reality." The inclusion and placement of Tagore's words in the exhibition may be read as an institutional intervention to reframe the works of art within discourses of innovation and experiment, rather than national tradition. In a Western art historical context in which non-Western modernisms have been repeatedly dismissed as weakly derivative, Aspects was the centerpiece of a concerted attempt to destabilize the perceived opposition between India and modernism. The introduction to the Aspects catalogue reiterated this argument, asserting that, quote, "contemporary Indian art is not a second-hand reworking of tendencies in the West, nor is it a withdrawal into a romantic past," unquote. In addressing stereotypical notions that modern Indian art can be neither authentic nor original, Oxford's exhibitions confronted decades of debate and discussion on the role of national tradition, both internationally and, as Subramanian's catalogue essay powerfully describes, within Indian cultural circles as well. If visitors were thereby intended to decenter considerations of Indian national essence, however, it seems that most did not comply. Critics of aspects of modern Indian art remained preoccupied with questions of authenticity, portraying the gallery as a battleground between new and old. Across the pages of local British and Indian publications, critics asked themselves whether the artist had succeeded or failed in coming up with a convincing resolution to the perceived conflict between their Eastern heritage and Western influences, usually understood as, quote, "a problem of style." Many felt that they had clearly failed the test of Indianness. Orientalist scholar Philip Rawson of Art Monthly went so far as to declare that, quote, "it doesn't really seem to work for Indian artists to rig themselves out à l'européenne." The artists failed to make interesting work, he suggested, because they were caught between their native, quote, "sensuality and savagery," and the, quote, "personal frustrations and class hatred that he associates with the West." Producing a failed compromise that sat awkwardly on artists, he implied, like a form of unconvincing drag. Valdemar Januszak in The Guardian reprised the trope. He predicted of the Royal Academy show that, quote, "it will be interesting to see how contemporary Indian artists stand up to the antiquity on show elsewhere, and if Western influences have begun to kill off the native tradition, grey squirrel style, as they usually do." Perhaps unsurprisingly, he found his expectations of the Darwinian triumph of Western art confirmed in Oxford, although Anish Kapoor, the only artist of the group working in Britain, was singled out for his unique artistic fusions. Other critics articulated their praise for the aspects through the same paradigm of struggle and reconciliation. The Oxford Star adopted a slightly confused biological metaphor, stating that, quote, "the seeds planted by Tagore have germinated through the post-war years of Western influence to produce a mature and variegated tree." Marina Vasey reached for a different natural metaphor in the Sunday Times, quote, "with high intelligence and verve, Indian artists are now using both their own traditions and those of the West to produce an idiomatic art about India today, which is something of its own. Far from being a mongrel art, it is a new species." Her language, which recalls and reverses Januszek's grey squirrel analogy, posits Indian modernists as active agents of artistic crossbreeding. The persistent agonism of the descriptions from those on both sides of the argument, with their recourse to metaphors of evolutionary struggle and mongrelization, are not just directly traceable to MoMA's framings. These repeatedly characterized the relationship between East and West as a productive one, of dialogue and transmutation. Quote, "The relationship between outside influence and indigenous tradition in modernist Indian art is far from simple. Outside influences are absorbed and transmuted, producing work which is substantially different from what it might appear to be at first sight," end quote, cautions the opening line of the MoMA newsletter, a warning which most writers blithely ignored. The museum also held a large show of British artist Peter Kinley's Indian-inspired paintings to coincide with the Indian exhibitions, an act that further refuted conventional unidirectional understandings of influence from centre to periphery. The critical response could be understood as the result of the inexperience of British artgoers with non-Western modernisms and the paucity of conceptual frameworks then available to understand processes of intercultural interaction. Many of the London Festival reviews, after all, were shaped by the same underlying assumptions. But the reviewers' preoccupation with notions of contending nationalisms may also have been partly rooted in a certain inconsistency and ambivalence at MoMA. While on the one hand, the museum argued for the individuality of its artists, the writings in the catalogue and newsletter are also awash with generalizations about Indian art and experience, whether it be the artist's, quote, direct and often raw relationship with society, their, quote, specifically Indian sensibility, their anguish, or the, quote, persistent call of their homeland. These nationalist characterizations coloured the whole of the Indian season in Oxford, including its title, Myth and Reality. Quote, "The concepts of myth and reality are often indivisible in modern India," end quote, claim the texts that were reprised throughout. The exhibitions did not purport to help the British visitor discriminate between myth and reality, in other words, but introduce them to a supposedly Indian mentality in which such distinctions are irrelevant. Although intended to be celebratory, that unifying concept of myth could play into long-standing cliches of Indian spirituality and exoticism, underlying cultural differences by suggesting that Indians shared an entirely different worldview to those from elsewhere. There is, as we know, a long and problematic history of British attempts to encapsulate the essence of Indian identity for display, but the politicised nature of national exhibitions did not change with decolonisation. Instead, as many scholars have shown, these periods of national formation offered vital opportunities to project coherent post-colonial identities suitable for the world stage. Assertions of national unity, Indian or otherwise, were an urgent political issue for post-colonial elites, and MoMA's presentation of Indianness may be understood in this context. While many of the generalizations chime with certain Orientalist tropes, there is no indication that these interpretations came from the British side. To the contrary, Al-Qazi wrote about his aspiration for the Oxford shows, and in particular the other India, to, quote, "give us an insight into the mind, the way of life, and the tribulations of the Indian people," end quote, conceived as a singular political group. Indian critics adopted the same discourse of national authenticity in praising MoMA's exhibitions, one celebrating Raza for having, quote, retained the vigour and resonance of his native environment, end quote, even when living abroad. The political urge to assert the image of a unified Indian citizenry sat uneasily with the gallery's innovative attempts to highlight the country's cultural multiplicity. This is nowhere more striking than in Myth and Reality's expurgation of religious tensions. The first section of aspects of modern Indian art was entitled "The Hinterland of Myth, Indian and Christian," a phrasing that sets India and Christianity in opposition. The section's conflicts conflate Indianness with Hinduism, erasing recent decades of violent religious conflict. MoMA had made a point of foregrounding Indian voices in the catalogues and working with Indian experts on the selection and interpretations of works, the design of the shows, and the publications. But although a vital step, it could not in itself resolve all problems of national representation. So 6 years into David Elliott's 20-year directorship of MoMA, the Season of Indian Art in 1982 was the first great statement of the interest in the visual culture of the Global South that would come to characterize the museum. However, the scale and ambition of myth and reality was never reprised. Instead, throughout the 80s and 90s, MoMA's stream of national survey shows favored more conventional modes of representation. Thank you.